Picture the Pomona Fairplex in February 1972. The NHRA Winternationals. The first major pro stock race of the season. The grandstands are packed. The air smells like nitromethane and exhaust. You can feel the engines in your chest before you even hear them fire. On one side of the staging area, there are factory-backed machines. Big cubic-inch monsters built by teams with full engineering departments behind them. These are cars that were born to race, built by people whose entire job was to win. And then, on the other side of that same starting line, a Chevrolet Vega. A subcompact economy car. The kind of car your neighbor drove to work. Barely longer than a bathtub. Engine that, on paper, had no business being in this field at all. Nobody in the grandstands was particularly worried about it. The competitors weren't worried. Even some of the NHRA officials who walked past it during tech inspection didn't give it a second look. They should have. Because what those officials didn't know, what they literally could not tell by looking at it, was that this Vega was not what it appeared to be. Bill Jenkins hadn't built a race car. He had built a problem. A problem that was going to spend the next 12 months making every other competitor in pro stock look like they were fighting the wrong war. A problem so technically sound, so fundamentally correct, that when NHRA officials finally understood what they were dealing with, they had only one real option left. They had to ban it. Not because it was dangerous. Not because Jenkins had cheated. But because if they didn't change the rules, the sport itself was going to break. Today we are going to take this story apart completely. We're going to look at exactly what Jenkins built, how he built it, and why it worked so well that it terrified an entire sanctioning body. We're going to talk about the politics, the factory teams, the money, the phone calls that got made when Jenkins kept winning. And we're going to talk about what happened after the ban. Because that part of the story is the part that most people never tell. And it changes everything about how you understand what Bill Jenkins actually accomplished. Stay with me here, because I want to start at the beginning, not at the racetrack, but in a machine shop in Pennsylvania. Because to understand what Jenkins built, you first have to understand who Bill Jenkins actually was. And that story is a lot more interesting than most people know. Bill Jenkins grew up in Malvern, Pennsylvania. He was not a showman. He was not photogenic in the way that motorsport likes its heroes to be. He didn't have a smooth television presence or a sponsored hauler or a public relations team. What he had was a machinist's brain. An obsessive, precise, relentless focus on how things worked at a mechanical level. He had been building and tuning engines since the 1950s, and by the time pro stock became an official class in 1970, he had already developed a reputation in the sport as someone you did not want lining up next to you. He earned the nickname Grumpy, honestly. He was direct to a fault. He didn't have patience for politics or flattery or the social lubricant that most motorsport personalities cultivated carefully. If you asked him a question and he thought it was a stupid question, he would tell you that it was a stupid question. But if you asked him something about engine geometry or chassis dynamics or fuel mixture ratios, he would talk for 2 hours and every single minute of it would be worth listening to. That combination, blunt personality, engineering genius, made him a complicated figure in a sport that was increasingly organized around sponsors and television contracts and factory relationships. Jenkins didn't particularly care about any of that. He cared about going fast. Now, to understand why the Vega was so disruptive, you have to understand what pro stock looked like in 1971 going into 72. Pro stock had been created as a class for what the NHRA called factory experimental cars. Vehicles that were recognizable as production automobiles but built for maximum performance. The idea was that a fan in the stands should be able to look at the car on the track and connect it to something they might buy or had seen in a showroom. In practice, what this meant was that the class was dominated by large American muscle cars. Dodge Challengers, Plymouth Plus, Ford Mustangs. Cars with big engines, production steel bodies, and considerable weight. The conventional wisdom of the era, and it was conventional wisdom that the factories themselves had helped create, was that in pro stock, cubic inches won races. More engine, more power, more wins. The teams with the biggest factory backing had the biggest budgets to develop bigger engines, and that cycle reinforced itself season after season. Jenkins had won races in this environment. He knew it well. He'd been competing in similar classes through the 1960s. But he also understood something that most of his competitors had not fully worked through yet. He understood that power was only one variable. And it wasn't the most important one. When Jenkins announced he was going to run a Chevrolet Vega in pro stock for 1972, the reaction from the paddock ranged from skepticism to outright ridicule. The Vega was a compact economy car. Chevy had introduced it in 1970 as their answer to the growing small import market. It was light, inexpensive, and powered by a small four-cylinder engine that had absolutely no performance pedigree. From the outside, building a pro-stock car around a Vega body shell seemed like a joke. The engine bays weren't designed for big block V8s. The car was physically smaller than everything else in the class. It looked like it didn't belong. That was, of course, precisely the point. Jenkins wasn't interested in the Vega because he liked the car. He was interested in the Vega because of what its dimensions allowed him to do with weight distribution, chassis geometry, and aerodynamic profile. He had done the math. He knew what was possible. And he knew that nobody else in the class was thinking about the problem the way he was thinking about it. Here is the simplest version of what Bill Jenkins understood that his competitors did not fully appreciate in 1972. In a drag race, the engine doesn't win by itself. The engine and the chassis are a system. The way that power gets translated to the rear wheels, the way the car reacts at launch, the way weight transfers when the throttle opens, all of those things determine how fast you actually go. You can have the most powerful engine in the field and lose to a smaller engine in a better chassis, because the better chassis is converting more of its available power into actual forward movement. Jenkins had spent years studying this relationship. He understood weight distribution at a level of detail that went well beyond what most teams were doing. And when he looked at the Vega, he saw a vehicle whose dimensions gave him the control over that relationship that a Challenger or a Mustang simply could not offer. It wasn't a crazy idea. It was, as it turned out, the correct idea. It was just ahead of where the sport was. But here's what I want you to really understand, and this is the part that makes the whole story make sense. Jenkins didn't just have a theory. He had built something specific, something concrete, that gave his theory physical form. And what he built inside that Vega body was so fundamentally different from what everyone else was doing that when NHRA officials finally looked at it closely, they genuinely didn't know how to classify it. The secret inside the car. The secret inside the Vega. The thing that changed everything was the chassis. Every other car in pro stock competition at that time was built on what is called a unibody or full-frame production platform. That means the structure of the car was fundamentally derived from a street vehicle. The floor pans, the firewall, the basic geometry of the body shell, these were production components that the team had modified, strengthened, and adapted for racing. But they started with what the factory gave them. Jenkins started with nothing. His Vega was built on a custom tube frame chassis. This means that underneath the sheet metal body of the Vega, underneath what people actually saw when they watched the car roll to the line, there was a completely purpose-built structure of steel tubing that Jenkins and his team had designed, fabricated, and welded themselves from the ground up. Think about it this way. Every other team in pro stock was working inside a house that somebody else had designed. They could renovate it, reinforce it, modify it, but the foundation was what it was. The rooms were roughly where the original architect put them. Jenkins built his own foundation. He got to decide where every wall went. And the specific decisions he made about where those walls went, about the geometry of the frame, about where the engine sat, about the placement of every major component. Those decisions gave him capabilities that no production-based chassis could replicate. The most important of those capabilities was weight distribution. In a drag race, the way weight is distributed across your 4 tire contact patches changes everything about how the car launches. When you accelerate hard, the front of the car wants to rise and the rear wants to squat. Weight transfers toward the back. And if you have engineered your car correctly, that weight transfer increases traction at the rear wheels, which is where the power is going, and the car hooks up hard and launches cleanly. If your weight distribution is wrong, you get will spin. You get a loose car. You get a slower elapsed time, regardless of how much horsepower you have. Jenkins had done meticulous calculations on this. Using the tube frame chassis, he could place the engine, the fuel cell, the battery, the driver, every heavy component, exactly where his math told him it needed to be to achieve optimal weight transfer at launch. He wasn't adapting to a chassis. The chassis was built around his specifications. The result was a car that, despite running a smaller displacement engine than many of its competitors, launched with a consistency and a violence that the bigger cars couldn't match. Not because it had more power, because more of the power it had was actually reaching the pavement. The rear tires hooked. Every time. That consistency is enormously valuable in a sport where hundredths of a second determine winners and losers. But the tube frame was only the first half of what Jenkins had built. The second half was the suspension geometry. The suspension of a drag car is not just about absorbing bumps. It is about controlling how the car moves under acceleration, specifically how much the rear suspension compresses, how quickly, and how that compression relates to the rotation of the rear axle. Jenkins had engineered the suspension on his Vega with the same from-scratch precision he had applied to the chassis. The geometry of the rear suspension, the angles, the link lengths, the pickup points, was calculated specifically for how he wanted the car to behave from the moment the throttle opened to the moment it crossed the finish line. This is genuinely complex engineering. It involves understanding not just static load but dynamic load, how weight moves through a vehicle under extreme acceleration. Most teams in 1972 were working with production suspension components and modifying them. Jenkins had designed his suspension for one purpose. The combination of the tube frame and the custom suspension geometry created a launch behavior that observers described as unlike anything else in the class. The Vega didn't just accelerate, it planted itself and drove forward with a flatness and a precision that made the bigger cars look like they were fighting themselves. There was one more element that made everything work together, and it was the simplest one. The Vega was lighter. The production steel body of a Vega, even reinforced for racing, was significantly lighter than the full-size muscle car bodies that everyone else was starting with. And because Jenkins had replaced the production platform with a purpose-built tube frame, he had eliminated a substantial amount of additional weight that came with those original steel floor pans and structural components. Weight is your enemy in drag racing. Every pound you carry is a pound that your engine has to accelerate down that quarter mile. Jenkins was carrying less weight, distributing it better, and extracting more of his available power through the pavement. The math was simple. The execution was anything but. During the 1972 season, the results were difficult to argue with. Jenkins and the Vega were consistently competitive in ways that defied the conventional understanding of how pro stock was supposed to work. Cars that outclassed the Vega on paper, bigger engines, more horsepower, factory backing, were losing to a compact car driven by a grumpy machinist from Pennsylvania. The reaction in the paddock changed gradually across the season. Early on, competitors and officials assumed there was something specific to a particular race, a particular track condition, a particular circumstance that explained what they were seeing. As the season went on, that explanation became harder to sustain. The Vega wasn't getting lucky. It was getting consistent. And consistency, in motor racing, is the mark of an engineering advantage, not a fluke. By mid-season, the whisper campaign had started. Teams were complaining. Officials were getting phone calls. And the questions people were asking were not really about whether Jenkins had done something illegal. They were about whether the spirit of the class, whatever that meant, was being violated by a car that looked like one thing and was actually something else entirely. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, because the story we've told so far is fundamentally the story of one man being smarter than his competition. And in most contexts, being smarter than your competition is called winning. But pro stock in 1972 was not most contexts. And what happened next tells you a great deal about the difference between a sport and a business. NHRA's response and the political fight. Here is the specific difficulty that NHRA officials faced when they started seriously examining the Vega. Bill Jenkins had not cheated. The car was within the dimensional limits of the class. The engine was within displacement limits. The weight met the minimum requirements. Every specific rule that existed, the Vega complied with. The problem was the tube frame chassis. Because the rules, as written in 1972, had not specifically prohibited a purpose-built tube frame structure. The rules had been written with the assumption that pro-stock cars would be built on production platforms. That was the intent. But intent is not the same as language. And the language of the rules had a gap in it. Jenkins had found that gap. He had exploited it completely legally. And now NHRA had to decide what to do about it. This is, in its own way, the most interesting moment in the whole story. Because the decision they faced was not really a technical decision. It was a political one. And the political pressure they were operating under was enormous. To understand that political pressure, you have to understand the economics of pro stock in 1972. The factory teams, the Dodge and Plymouth and Ford efforts, were not hobby projects. They were marketing investments. The manufacturers were spending money on these programs because winning in pro stock sold cars. The connection between track performance and showroom traffic was direct and intentional. That was the entire point of the class from the manufacturer's perspective. When Jenkins started beating those factory teams with a car that had no factory backing whatsoever, with a car, in fact, that didn't even use an engine configuration that any of the factories were promoting, it undermined the narrative that those manufacturers had built their programs around. If a privately funded car with a smaller engine could consistently beat factory machines, what exactly were the factories selling when they put their name on a pro stock program? What was the marketing message? We have a bigger budget than this guy, but he still beats us? The phone calls that went to NHRA's offices during the 1972 season were not subtle. Factory teams were direct about their unhappiness. They had invested significant money in programs built around the established order of the class, the order where displacement and factory backing determined outcomes. Jenkins had broken that order, and they wanted the organization to fix it. NHRA was not indifferent to these concerns, and it's important to be honest about why. Pro stock had become one of the most popular classes in the organization's events. Fan interest was high. Television coverage was expanding. Sponsorship money was flowing in largely because of the factory involvement. If the factory teams walked, if Dodge and Plymouth and Ford decided that the return on investment in pro stock wasn't there, the economics of the class changed dramatically. The NHRA was a sanctioning body, but it was also an organization that had bills to pay and events to run and staff to support. The financial health of the organization was tied, in no small measure, to keeping the major manufacturers engaged and spending money on programs. This is the uncomfortable reality of every major motorsport series, and it was no different in 1972. The rules are written to produce good racing. But good racing, in practice, often means racing that keeps the big money participants happy enough to stay. Those two things are not always the same thing. What NHRA did in response to the 1972 season was introduce new regulations for pro stock that addressed the tube frame chassis, but did so in language that was framed around structural integrity, safety, and the preservation of the spirit of the production-based class. The new rules essentially mandated that pro stock cars maintain significant portions of their production body structure. The full tube frame replacement approach that Jenkins had used was restricted in ways that made it either impractical or illegal depending on how you read the specific language. The framing was careful. Nobody at NHRA said publicly, "We are changing the rules because Bill Jenkins beat the factory teams and they complained." The official language was about standardizing construction practices and ensuring that pro stock remained connected to production vehicles in a meaningful way. Jenkins, characteristically, was not impressed by the framing. He understood exactly what had happened. In interviews from that period, he was direct about it. The rules had been changed to stop a car that had beaten the teams with the political connections to demand a response. He didn't say it with particular bitterness. He said it as a statement of fact, the way he said most things. The practical effect of the new regulations was to significantly limit the structural freedom that a tube frame chassis provided. Teams still had room to modify and customize their chassis within the new rules, but the degree to which they could depart from the production platform was constrained in ways that eliminated much of the weight distribution advantage that Jenkins had exploited. Other aspects of the regulations that followed in subsequent years also addressed minimum weight requirements, engine placement rules, and chassis construction standards in ways that, taken together, moved the technical envelope of the class back toward a configuration where factory-backed teams with large displacement engines had a clearer competitive advantage. Whether you think those changes were justified or not probably depends on what you think pro stock was supposed to be. If you think it was supposed to be a class where the most innovative engineering wins, the rule changes were exactly what Jenkins said they were: institutional protection of the established order. If you think it was supposed to be a class that maintained a meaningful connection to production vehicles and gave factory teams a legitimate promotional platform, the argument for the changes is more defensible. Most people who knew the sport at the time thought it was probably both things at once. And that tension never really went away. What Jenkins did after the new rules were introduced is, in some ways, more revealing than anything he did with the Vega. He didn't retire. He didn't sue. He didn't make a prolonged public campaign against the rule changes. He did what he always did. He went back into the shop and started working within the new constraints, looking for the next edge. He continued to compete in pro stock through the 1970s and remained a force in the class even as the rules evolved around him. What he never received, and this is worth saying directly, was the kind of public acknowledgement that his contribution deserved. He didn't get a Lifetime Achievement Award from NHRA while he was at the peak of his powers. He didn't get a television segment that explained to fans what he had actually done in 1972. He got a rule change named, informally, after the problem he had created. That was about it. Here's what I find most remarkable about this entire story, and it's the part that nobody seems to want to talk about directly. After banning Jenkins' approach, after writing rules specifically designed to prevent what he had done, The NHRA spent the next decade watching every serious competitor in pro stock quietly adopt the principles that Jenkins had demonstrated. The car was banned. The ideas were not. And that tells you something important about what actually happened in 1972. What came after, and why it still matters. Let's talk about what pro stock looks like today. Or, more precisely, let's talk about what pro stock looked like by the early 1980s, because the evolution is instructive. After the rule changes of 1972 and 1973 restricted the most aggressive tube frame constructions, teams continued to push the boundaries of chassis development within the new rules. And the direction that development pushed was, consistently, toward lighter cars with better weight distribution and more carefully engineered suspension geometry. In other words, toward the things that Bill Jenkins had built his Vega around. The specific construction approach was different. Teams weren't building identical copies of what Jenkins had done. The rules didn't allow that. But the underlying engineering logic, the understanding that weight distribution and chassis geometry were as important as displacement, that became the shared understanding of the entire class. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, virtually every serious pro stock effort was paying close attention to exactly the variables that Jenkins had identified in 1972. The engineers working at the front of the class were thinking about the problems the way Jenkins had been thinking about them a decade earlier. The car was banned. The thinking wasn't. And that distinction matters enormously if you're trying to assess what Jenkins actually contributed to the sport. Beyond his own racing career, Jenkins' influence on pro stock spread through the work he did as an engine builder and tuner for other competitors. Over the course of his career, Jenkins built or developed engines that were used by numerous competitive teams. His understanding of small-block Chevrolet engine development, the specific modifications that extracted maximum performance within the rules, was sought after across the sport. There is a chain of influence that runs from Jenkins' machine shop in Pennsylvania through generations of pro stock engine development. Teams that competed against him, lost to him, and then came to him for engines. Builders who learned their craft from people who had worked with or learned from Jenkins. The knowledge spread because it was demonstrably correct, and the sport moved forward in the direction he had pointed. This is the quieter, less dramatic part of the legacy. It doesn't make for a tidy television moment. But it is probably where Jenkins' influence on the shape of modern pro stock is most deeply embedded. Jenkins continued to compete through the 1970s with varying results. He won races. He remained competitive. But the sustained dominance of the 1972 Vega era was not replicated. Some of that was the rule changes removing the specific advantage he had built. Some of it was the natural evolution of the sport. As his ideas spread and became common practice, they stopped being an advantage and became baseline expectations. He was inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame, which acknowledged his contributions to the sport in the way that such institutions do, with a plaque and a ceremony and words that don't fully capture what actually happened. He passed away in 2012. The coverage of his death in the motorsport press was respectful and accurate, but not extensive. He had not been racing at a high level for many years. A generation of fans had grown up watching pro stock without necessarily knowing his name. That is a common fate for people who change the technical direction of a sport. The innovations become invisible because they become universal. Everyone does it the way you did it, which means nobody has to remember that you were the one who figured it out first. I want to say something here that I think is important, and I want to say it directly rather than just implying it. The story of Bill Jenkins and the 1972 Vega is not primarily a story about drag racing. It's a story about what happens when one person's correct thinking runs ahead of the institutional framework that's supposed to govern their field. Jenkins had found a better way to build a pro stock car. Not a different way, a better way, in the sense that the results consistently demonstrated its superiority. In a purely technical competition, that should have been the end of the story. Best engineering wins. Class advances. Everyone adjusts. But pro stock was not a purely technical competition. It was a business ecosystem with manufacturers and sponsors and a sanctioning body that had obligations to all of those parties. And when Jenkins' correct thinking threatened the economics of that ecosystem, the ecosystem defended itself. That pattern, correct individual thinking versus institutional self-protection, is not unique to motorsport. You have seen it in other industries, other sports, other arenas. The person who figures out the better way gets regulated, restricted, or legislated around. The institution absorbs what it can use and blocks what it can't control. Jenkins understood this perfectly. He didn't rage against it. He adapted and kept working. Which, in its own way, is also a kind of lesson. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. Bill Jenkins rolled a Chevy Vega, a grocery getter, a car that cost less than a good used pickup, onto the most competitive drag racing stage in the country. He had built something underneath that ordinary-looking sheet metal that was more sophisticated than anything else in the field. And he had done it largely alone, without factory backing, without a major sponsor, without a public relations team telling his story. He didn't need anybody to tell his story. The elapsed times did it for him. The NHRA changed the rules. And then, quietly, over the decade that followed, every team in pro stock started thinking about weight distribution and chassis geometry and launch behavior the way Bill Jenkins had been thinking about them in a machine shop in Pennsylvania in 1971. He never cared about being celebrated. He cared about being right. In the end, every pro stock car that has ever run since then has been, in some way, proving that he was. I want to leave you with one question, and I genuinely want to know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the NHRA made the right call when they changed the rules after 1972? There is a real argument on both sides. The factories had built programs around certain expectations, and those programs brought money and fan interest to the sport that benefited everyone, including Jenkins. Changing the competitive landscape overnight by allowing unlimited chassis innovation had consequences that went beyond just Jenkins winning. On the other hand, Jenkins had not broken a rule. He had been smarter. And the history of motorsport is largely built on people being smarter than the existing rules anticipated. Where do you stand on that? Drop it in the comments. I read all of them, and this is one I genuinely want to hear different perspectives on. If this kind of real engineering history is what you come here for, the actual story behind the official story, the technical details that explain why the outcomes happened the way they did, there is a lot more where this came from. Every video on this channel is built the same way. Subscribe if that is what you want more of. Simple as that. Next time, we are going to look at someone who Jenkins actually had respect for. A competitor who approached the same fundamental engineering problems from a completely different direction, and who ended up in an equally complicated relationship with the NHRA as a result. Different car. Different approach. Same pattern. I think you will find it very familiar.